Usually, when we look at a biography, we kind of expect to find a map, a nice logical map with clear paved roads. You start at point A, follow the struggles, track the successes, and then you just neatly arrive at point B, which is the person's legacy. It's safe,
Yeah.
charted territory.
Right, yeah. We really crave that linear narrative. We want to see the exact blueprint of, how a person's life led directly to the empire they built.
Exactly. But then you pick up the life story of Howard Phillips Lovecraft.
Yeah.
And suddenly that map just completely drops off into an uncharted ocean. The roads vanish, the compass spins wildly, and you were just left staring at a blank space on the parchment that essentially just says, "Here be monsters."
That is a perfect way to put it.
Yeah. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we are opening up a massive stack of sources, university archives, literary critiques, and even some crumbling pulp magazines to explore the undisputed father of cosmic horror.
We're really unpacking the paradox of H.P. Lovecraft today.
And even if you listening have never read a single word he actually published, I guarantee you've seen his fingerprints. I mean, they are all over modern sci-fi cinema, the survival horror video games you play, even some of the music you listen to.
Oh, absolutely. The influence is everywhere.
But the mission today isn't just to list his creations. We're going to explore how a deeply isolated, tragedy-stricken guy from Providence, Rhode Island, a man who, frankly, died in total tragic obscurity, managed to create a mythology that eventually conquered global pop culture.
Yeah, and to really understand those cosmic monsters that dominate our screens today, we have to look directly at the very real, very terrestrial horrors of his childhood. Because, the architecture of his entire worldview was built on this foundation of early trauma.
So let's set the scene for that. It's 1890. We're in Providence, Rhode Island. He's born into a wealthy family at 454 Angel Street. And on paper, it sounds idyllic, just a grand Victorian upbringing.
Right. On paper, yes. But that wealth offered zero protection from what was actually happening inside the family. So when Lovecraft was only 3 years old, his father, Winfield, who worked as a traveling salesman, suffered a just catastrophic nervous breakdown in a Chicago hotel.
Wow. 3 years old.
Yeah, he was hallucinating, raving, and he had to be physically brought back to Providence and committed to Butler Hospital.
Which, the sources note, is a psychiatric hospital where he stayed for 5 whole years before he died.
Exactly. He died of paresis, which is a form of neurosyphilis. And the disease essentially eats away at the brain. It causes profound illusions, severe personality changes, and eventual paralysis.
That's terrifying.
It really is. Imagine being a highly intelligent, perceptive young child, and your primary understanding of adulthood is basically just watching your father's mind physically disintegrate.
And the really tragic irony here is that years later, his mother Sarah would suffer her own severe mental breakdown, right? And she ends up dying in that exact same hospital.
Sure.
So Butler Hospital just looms over his entire childhood like a gargoyle.
It truly does. So in the absence of his parents, young Howard is largely raised by his grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips. And the grandfather's way of entertaining this fragile, sickly little boy is by inventing these incredibly dark, off-the-cuff gothic horror tales.
Which is, that's an intense way to parent a kid who is already surrounded by real-life nightmares.
Oh, without a doubt. But Lovecraft isn't just sitting there passively observing all this. He's an absolute prodigy. He's reading at age 3, writing poetry at 6.
Right, and by his pre-teens, the archives show he's publishing his own hectographed astronomy and science journals.
Yes, the hectograph journals.
Wait, let's pause on that.
Yeah.
Because for those of us who aren't early 20th century printing press operators, what exactly is a hectograph journal?
Oh, it's fascinating. It was this primitive DIY printing process. You would make a thick slab of gelatin, right? Then you write your master copy in this special ink, press it onto the gelatin to transfer the ink, and
I
then...
said the jelly acts like a stamp.
Exactly. Then you press blank pages onto the jelly to make copies. It was messy, really painstaking work. But you have this young, deeply isolated boy sitting in his room, meticulously printing out journals about the vastness of the solar system.
See, that feels incredibly symbolic to me. He is out there soaking up the infinite, terrifying vastness of the cosmos through a telescope, trying to organize it onto gelatin prints, while his immediate physical world is just completely crumbling around him.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it.
So, did watching his parents lose their minds plant the seed for his most famous literary trope? Because, his entire brand is this idea that learning the true nature of the universe will literally drive you insane.
Well, the archival sources strongly suggest a direct line there, yeah. He wasn't just writing spooky stories to be scary. He was actively processing his reality. His early exposure to profound mental decay basically taught him that the human mind is incredibly fragile. He learned, well before he even hit puberty, that our perception of reality is just a thin, protective veneer. If you scratch it or if you see what's really underneath, the mind just shatters to protect itself.
So you think that writing was almost like a kind of therapy for him then, a way to heal that childhood trauma?
You'd think so, but actually the literature suggests it was almost the opposite. He wasn't writing to heal himself. He was writing to prove that the universe was just as broken and terrifying as his own family dynamic.
Yeah, and that terrifying dynamic only gets worse. Because in 1904, his grandfather dies, and with him goes the family fortune. They lose the lavish Angel Street home, and the sources say Lovecraft is so devastated by this sudden plunge into poverty that he actively contemplates suicide.
It was a very dark period. He suffers a massive nervous breakdown in 1908, and this prevents him from graduating high school. He never makes it to Brown University, which had been his lifelong dream.
Right.
And from 1908 until roughly 1913, he lives as a complete hermit. I mean, he barely leaves his darkened bedroom. He is effectively a ghost in his own life.
But the thing that pulls this guy out of his total isolation is, well, it's just fascinating to me. It isn't a medical intervention. It isn't like a great romance that shows him the beauty of the world. It is, quite literally, hate mail.
It has to be one of the strangest turning points in American literary history.
Seriously. Think about this for a second. The mastermind of cosmic terror, the creator of unnameable alien gods, gets his start by doing the 1913 equivalent of firing off angry internet comments.
Yeah, sitting in his room, furious.
Exactly. He's reading a popular pulp magazine called The Argosy, and he gets so deeply offended by the romance stories of a writer named Fred Jackson that he writes a scathing letter to the magazine's editor.
He was just so furious that Jackson's stories were, in his view, insipid and overly sentimental.
Yeah.
So Lovecraft attacks him, but he does it by writing these incredibly elaborate, rollicking, rhyming couplets.
Wait, rhyming couplets?
Yeah, heroic verse, completely tearing down a romance novelist.
So he basically wrote a diss track in the form of Victorian poetry.
That is exactly what it was.
And the magazine actually publishes it, which sparks this massive debate in the letter columns over several issues. People are writing in to defend Fred Jackson. Lovecraft is firing back with more poetry. It's a full-on flame war in print.
And that printed flame war catches the attention of a group called the United Amateur Press Association, or the UAPA. They are so impressed by Lovecraft's vocabulary and sheer dedication to arguing that they invite him to join their ranks.
Okay, but how does an amateur press network actually function back then? If he's a total hermit, how is this connecting him to anyone?
Well, it functioned essentially like a slow-motion internet forum. The UAPA was a nationwide network of amateur writers who would print their own physical zines, bundle them up, and mail them to each other across the country.
Oh, wait.
Yeah, so you would read someone's essay in California, write a response in Rhode Island, print it, and mail it back. The turnaround time was weeks or even months.
Which is absolutely perfect for a recluse.
Exactly. The slow pace allowed Lovecraft to meticulously craft a persona. He didn't have to be the traumatized high school dropout who lost his family fortune. In these letters, he could be an aristocratic, hyper-educated literary critic.
It gave him an audience and, more importantly, a sense of purpose. Lovecraft himself later admitted that this network saved him from a state of vegetation. It transitioned him from a depressed hermit to a prolific correspondent.
And that renewed energy is what pushes him to write fiction again. It even leads to a shocking life change. In 1924, he marries a woman named Sonia Green and actually moves to New York City.
Which is a huge leap. He attempts a new beginning, but the move to New York quickly turns into a crucible. The dense, chaotic environment of the city doesn't cure his anxieties at all. It completely amplifies his darkest traits.
It does. The reality of the 1920s hits him incredibly hard. The marriage falters almost immediately. Sonia's hat shop goes bankrupt, her health fails, and she eventually has to move away for work.
Leaving Lovecraft totally alone in a seedy ground-floor apartment in Red Hook, Brooklyn. And this is where his deep-seated prejudices curdle into something truly toxic.
Yeah.
Now, looking objectively at the letters preserved in the Brown University archives, the writings from this period are steeped in a venomous, obsessive xenophobia.
Yes.
And I want to be very clear to you listening. As researchers, we have to look directly at this ugly history. We are simply reporting the facts of the source text here, absolutely not endorsing his views. But You just cannot separate his personal prejudices from the DNA of his horror.
You really can't. You have to look at the whole picture. He was a man obsessed with traditionalism and bloodlines, and suddenly he found himself in the middle of a bustling, incredibly diverse, immigrant-heavy metropolis. He was utterly terrified of the cultural mixing he saw on the streets of New York.
It's a deep phobia for him.
Right. And the author China Miéville makes a crucial point about this in the literary critiques. There is nothing incidental about racism in Lovecraft's work. It is the central engine of his terror.
So to put that into perspective for you listening, when you read a story about alien miscegenation, which is the terrifying sci-fi concept of humans interbreeding with monsters, that isn't just a spooky imagination at work. It is a direct, unfiltered translation of his real-world prejudice.
Exactly. Look at The Shadow over Innsmouth. The entire plot revolves around a decaying coastal town where the human residents have secretly been breeding with horrific, immortal fish monsters called the Deep Ones.
Right.
The horror of the story isn't that the monsters are going to eat you. The real horror for Lovecraft is that your bloodline might be tainted by them, that you might suddenly discover you share their genetics. The dread of unnatural mixing is the absolute core of the narrative.
It's a really heavy realization. Knowing that some of the most foundational horror in modern literature was built explicitly on a framework of real-world xenophobia, you'd think hitting absolute rock bottom in New York, surrounded by everything he so deeply despised, would completely break him, maybe end his writing career for good.
You'd think so, but retreating from New York back to the safety of Providence in 1926 actually acted like a pressure cooker for all that accumulated dread. He takes the very localized personal fears he developed in Brooklyn and expands them outward into this massive universal philosophy.
And this becomes the golden era of his writing. He returns home and produces the heavy hitters, The Call of Cthulhu. At the Mountains of Madness, he develops what we now call cosmicism, or cosmic indifferentism.
Cosmicism is really the defining architecture of Lovecraftian horror. It argues that the universe is vast, entirely mechanical, and completely devoid of any recognizable divine presence. Humanity isn't the center of creation. We are just a microscopic accident of proximity.
Let's dwell on that for a second, because this is a massive shift in how we tell scary stories.
Mm.
Up until this point, traditional Gothic horror was very human-centric. Like, a demon wants your specific soul, or a ghost is haunting your specific house to get revenge on you personally.
Right, traditional monsters imply that you actually matter. If a demon is hunting you, you are important enough to warrant the attention of the supernatural.
Yes. We want a universe that cares about us, even if it cares about us enough to torture us. The devil implies a divine order. But Lovecraft comes along and just replaces the devil with the absolute void. It's like looking through a telescope, the vastness of space, and suddenly realizing that not only are we microscopic, but the universe doesn't even know we're here.
That's a great analogy. He introduces entities like Cthulhu, this massive squid-headed monstrosity sleeping in a sunken city, or Azathoth, a blind, idiot god that just writhes at the center of the universe, churning out chaos.
And they aren't evil, right?
Exactly. They aren't evil. They don't want to conquer humanity or harvest our souls. They operate on physical laws we literally cannot comprehend, and they care as much about humans as a human cares about a colony of ants they accidentally step on while walking down the street.
That is the ultimate aha moment of his work for me. The true horror isn't gore. It isn't a jump scare. It's displacement.
Displacement. It is the paralyzing realization that human consciousness is just a blip. There are incomprehensible forces out there that could wipe our entire planet out without a second thought, not out of malice, but out of sheer indifference. It is the horror of the unknowable.
Lovecraft had that famous quote, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown."
Beautifully said.
He literally drafted an entire mythology just to explain how meaningless we are. But the tragic irony of his biography is that while he created a philosophy that spanned the entire galaxy, his own physical world remained incredibly small.
It did. He spent his final years in Providence constantly struggling for money. He was surviving by ghostwriting and doing uncredited revision work for other authors. The letters show he was deeply, deeply affected by the suicide of his close pen pal, Robert E. Howard, the writer who created Conan the Barbarian.
Oh, that's incredibly sad.
Yeah. And shortly after that, Lovecraft himself died of intestinal cancer in 1937. He was only 46 years old.
And he died convinced that his life's work was an utter failure. He never saw a true, standalone hardcover book of his own stories published during his lifetime. All of his work was just scattered across cheap pulp magazines like Weird Tales, printed on paper that was literally designed to disintegrate after a few years.
He went to his grave fully envisioning the ultimate oblivion of his writing. But his friends, particularly two writers named August Derleth and Donald Wandre, absolutely refused to let his work disappear into the void.
Right.
They took a massive financial risk and founded a publishing firm called Arkham House for the sole purpose of preserving his stories in premium hardcovers, beginning with The Outsider and others in 1939.
Thank goodness they did. But, it wasn't just the physical printing of the books that secured his legacy. It was actually how he treated his intellectual property while he was still alive. Because for a guy who was a total hermit, he was incredibly generous with his ideas.
This is where we see the sheer scale of his correspondence. Historians estimate Lovecraft wrote upwards of 100,000 letters during his lifetime.
100,000.
Over his lifetime, yeah. He was constantly writing to other authors. And in those letters, he actively encouraged his friends to use his monsters.
He'd write to a buddy in California and say, hey, I mentioned this forbidden book called the Necronomicon in my last story. You should casually drop the name of it in your next story.
Exactly. He allowed them to borrow his settings, like the cursed town of Arkham, or reference entities like Cthulhu. He wanted his creations to feel like genuine, ancient folklore. Because if multiple, completely unconnected authors are all referencing the same dark gods, it creates a powerful illusion of reality.
He essentially invented the concept of a shared cinematic universe, or like an open-source mythology, decades before Marvel or comic books made it popular. By letting his friends play in his sandbox, he guaranteed that his monsters would outlive him.
And because he showed that sandbox, the mythology mutated, it adapted, and it eventually infected every conceivable corner of modern pop culture.
The influence is just staggering once you start looking for it. In cinema, John Carpenter's famous Apocalypse trilogy, especially movies like The Thing and In the Mouth of Madness, is just pure Lovecraft. When Ridley Scott made Alien, the screenwriter Dan O'Bannon and the designer H.R. Giger both explicitly cited Lovecraft's cosmic dread as their primary inspiration.
You have modern masters like Guillermo del Toro and Stephen King praising him. King has famously stated that Lovecraft remains the 20th century's greatest practitioner of the classic horror tale.
And it bleeds out of literature entirely, too. If you've ever played massive tabletop games like Arkham Horror or video games like Bloodborne or Amnesia, you have navigated his world. Heavy metal bands like Metallica have entire instrumental tracks like The Call of Cthulhu and The Thing that should not be based directly on his stories. It is a thoroughly unkillable legacy.
Which brings us to the profound irony that modern literary critiques highlight. Lovecraft was a deeply conservative, prejudiced man who was terrified of a changing, diverse world. Yet he created a vast, open architecture universe. And today, brilliant progressive writers, authors like Ruthana Emrys or Victor Laval, are using Lovecraft's own mythos to explore and actively subvert his racist tropes.
That is just the ultimate poetic justice to me. They are taking the very tools he left behind to dismantle the prejudices he held.
It proves that a mythology can outgrow its creator. The foundation of his cosmic horror was built so sturdily that entirely new generations can move into it, renovate the house, and use it to tell stories that reflect modern fears.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We really followed the map from a traumatized, precocious boy printing gelatin zines in a darkened Victorian house to a struggling pulp writer terrified of the New York streets to the posthumous godfather of cosmic horror.
A man whose highly specific personal demons metamorphosed into universal monsters.
So to you listening, the next time you find yourself looking up at the night sky and you get that sudden dizzying chill, realizing just how small you are against the infinite dark, or when you're playing a survival video game where your weapons are useless and your only option is to run and hide from something you don't understand, remember that you're experiencing the direct echo of Lovecraft's displacement.
And it leaves us with a final vital question to mull over. If Lovecraft's invention of cosmic horror was driven by his personal inability to cope with a rapidly changing, diverse, and scientifically expanding world in the 1920s, well, what does our massive modern obsession with his monsters say about us today? With our own deep-seated anxieties about artificial intelligence, climate change, and our fragile place on a pale blue dot in an endless universe, are we simply projecting our own modern dread? Are we, too, just waiting for Cthulhu to wake up?
We like to think we have the map all figured out. We like to think we understand the science and the boundaries of our reality. But maybe the map is still dropping off into the dark water. Here be monsters indeed.